Hello and welcome to the Business Talk podcast. I'm your host Deepak. I'm honored to welcome Professor Isaac Baley, Associate Professor of Economics at University Pompeu Fabra, Associate Researcher at CREI, and Affiliated Professor at the Barcelona School of Economics as our esteemed guest on today's podcast episode. Professor Baley is also a research affiliate of Center for Economic Policy Research. His research focuses on understanding decision-making in environments with microeconomic frictions, for example, information frictions, search frictions, irreversibilities, and adjustment cost, and its broader macroeconomic implications. His work explores diverse areas, including firms' pricing and investment strategies, monetary policy, international trade, and labor markets. He co-authored the book The Data Economy, published this year by Princeton University Press and jointly written with Professor Laura Veldkamp, who was featured in Business Talk in episode 76. Before transitioning to academia, Professor Baley served as an economic advisor to the Mexican Ministries of Economics and Finance, where he played a key role in developing policies aimed at improving access to financial market. Professor Isaac Baley earned his PhD in economics from New York University and a master's in economic theory from the Autonomous Technological Institute of Mexico. In this episode, Professor Isaac Baley will share key insights from his research. Can global uncertainty promote international trade? So without further delay, let's welcome Professor Isaac Baley to the podcast. Professor Isaac, it is an honor and privilege to have you join us today.
Thank you very much, Deepak. The honor is mine to talk to you.
Thank you. Professor Isaac, your academic contributions are exceptional and deeply inspiring. Could you share your journey with our audience and what led you to explore this topic?
Yes, thank you. So, as you mentioned before, I am from Mexico City. And mathematics, and then in Mexico, there was a big connection between academia and the government. And I entered the government, the Ministry of Finance, and that led me to study how we could improve by changing laws and thinking of economic policy to improve access to credit for small and medium firms. And then as the path from there, I did my PhD and I started working actually with Professor Veldkamp, as you mentioned, that we now wrote the book, which actually have it here, that you talked about it in a previous episode.
Yes.
And she introduced me to thinking about the role of imperfect information, uncertainty in macroeconomics, in labor markets, in pricing. Then we wrote this joint work with another colleague, Michael Waugh, on thinking about trade, which we're going to talk about today. And more broadly, I think not only information is one of the main frictions that as humans, households, firms, we face. We need to have information in order to make decisions. Understanding how information is acquired, how it is used, and how we can shape our choices is very exciting, and that's what I think it also has a very important policy impact, because the amount of information that agents have and how they use it is key for responsiveness to policy. So that brings together my research trying to understand these topics.
Yeah, very insightful. Professor, what exactly is uncertainty and how is it differ from volatility or even from disagreement?
That's a very good question, because sometimes these terms tend to be used interchangeably, and I think it's important to define it. So first, volatility just refers to how different variables move over time. Okay, so for example, is GDP some quarter is high, the other is low. That is volatility, and we would say that would be a very highly volatile environment. However, uncertainty is really when we don't know what these outcomes are going to be. So even if GDP moves up and down, for example, we might think that in December, because of the end of the year, there's a lot of sales. That may look like a big change from previous months, but that's perfectly predictable. So really uncertainty is when we don't know these outcomes. And you could even have a perfectly stable environment where there might be some policy change or something that makes agents feel uncertain. Then you also mentioned disagreement, which is sometimes used also to think about uncertainty, but disagreement is really when different people have different ideas about what will happen, different beliefs about what will happen. So for example, you may think that GDP is going to go up next quarter. I think that GDP is going to go down. That's disagreement. And of course, that's going to create uncertainty because different people are saying different things. But again, I think it's important to distinguish these concepts.
Professor, what are the main sources of trade-related uncertainty that exporting firms face today?
So I would say there's different, again, going back to uncertainty, which is situations in which, in this case, firms and exporters in this context might not know what is the environment they face. And I think for them, the key variable that they would like to know is what's going to be the relative price of the product they're selling, they're exporting. Okay. So thinking on these terms, on the one side, there will be demand uncertainty, which is just, I might not be, imagine I am a producer of semiconductors, and I would like to know what is the demand for my product in foreign markets. And this may again fluctuate, and I might not know exactly what's going to be that demand. So that's one source of uncertainty, the demand uncertainty. Then you can also think perhaps of a technology uncertainty that I might not know exactly what are going to be there might be supply chain disruptions or other types of risks that I might not know exactly how they're gonna fan out. So it's we have demand, let's say production uncertainty, and a third one that I think is key, especially in the times that we're living right now, is what is known as policy uncertainty. And here is really when firms and households also might not know what the policymakers are planning to do. It could be in response to a shock. For instance, during the COVID pandemic, there was not only a lot of uncertainty about how the pandemic would evolve, but what policies the fiscal and monetary authorities and others, health authorities, would implement for this shock. And I think this is particularly interesting in this context that we're living right now with all the different export controls, quotas, tariffs, and not only about the tariff again, because it might be moving all the time, but is that we don't know what that tariff is gonna be. So this would be, I would say, there are many more, but the three ones: the technology, demand, and in this case also policy uncertainty that are affecting exporters in particular.
So in this case, how does a firm's individual response to uncertainty differ from what happens at the aggregate level?
Okay, so I think this is first we should distinguish what type of uncertainties out there. A firm could be facing uncertainty about individual conditions. For instance, what would be the particular demand for their own product? But we can also think about aggregate uncertainty. For instance, in the case we were talking before about policy uncertainty, that is something that would affect many sectors, many firms, many markets. So it's important to distinguish first uncertainty about individual characteristics and uncertainty about aggregate economic conditions. And once we make that distinction, we can also think that it's going to be different if a particular firm is facing a more uncertain environment. For instance, that might make her decide not to enter a new market or do particular choices in order to reduce those risks. But it's very different if we have many firms facing the same type of uncertainty, because then that's when we say that we should take into account general equilibrium, which means that prices, wages, interest rates, and other aggregate prices and variables might be changing. Everybody's facing a more uncertain environment. So I think now that we're going to enter discussions more in more concrete terms, it's always important to distinguish these two: individual effects, where we like to call partial equilibrium; aggregate effects, which is general equilibrium; and also the sources of uncertainty, micro or macro.
Traditionally, uncertainty is seen as a deterrent to trade. How does your research challenge this notion, and what key mechanism enable uncertainty to fuel trade?
Okay, so first, like a deterrent to trade. Again, I think if in many situations, if you think of firms that are risk averse in the sense that they might dislike risk, if you enter an environment where there is, let's say, terms of trade are very volatile and uncertain, that may tell firms, you know what, I might prefer to stay away from this risky type of activity, and they might cut back on their exports. And also importantly, how can uncertainty deter trade, especially if you're thinking about entry, thinking about exploring new markets or new products. There is a concept called an options effect, that basically in a very uncertain environment, you might prefer to wait and see until this uncertainty is resolved. So I would say these two views, thinking about impartial equilibrium, a single firm facing more uncertain environment, and especially if they need to enter a new market, that would deter trade. Now, why would we say, in my work with Professor Belkamp and Waugh, that uncertainty could actually fuel more trade? So a key component of our analysis is going back to this general equilibrium effects. And what we find is, and we show theoretically, that in an environment where you do have more terms of trade volatility, in equilibrium, that's also going to generate higher returns to this activity. So we don't want to say that more uncertainty always is going to generate more trade. What we want to point is that there's two factors. There is more volatility, but that in equilibrium might also generate higher average returns to exporting. And therefore, you have a trade-off between these two. More volatility, more uncertainty, but at the same time, more return. So that's what you could have a situation where you have more uncertainty and the average returns effect dominate the uncertainty, and that's what could fuel more trade.
Professor, your model highlights how information frictions influence trade dynamics. Could you explain how imperfect information about foreign markets leads to increased trade instead of reducing it?
Okay, Deepak, so you're asking particular case in which we could actually get this more trade. So let me go back again to what are these information frictions. How do we like to think about them? So when you are not perfectly informed about your trade partner, there might be more opportunities to trade. So for example, imagine that we have a lottery ticket in order to make 100 euros, but we already know the outcome of the lottery, if it's a winner. So if I come to Deepak and want to sell you this ticket, you will tell me, well, I know if it's a winner or not, and there will be so there's not really any ex ante way in which we can insure each other for risk. However, if we're in a world in which I don't really know what's going to be the conditions in your market, and you also don't know what are the conditions in my market, there might be opportunities to share this risk. Going back to the lottery ticket example, if we don't know if it's a winner, I could tell you, Deepak, are you willing to, we split the profits. You might be able, there'll be a price in which you would like to buy this ticket together, and they insure each other. Okay. So here, how we like to think about information frictions is really a mutual lack of knowledge or perfect knowledge about the conditions in other country, and that may amplify risk sharing. So let me give you another. We know that terms of trade, which again, it will be the ratio of your exports divided by my exports, that determines the price of our goods in the international market. So already terms of trade are a good hedge against risk. Because if you're in a situation where your good is pretty scarce and mine is abundant, the terms of trade are going to make your good is much more valuable than mine. So you're going to be able to consume a lot of my good when you have little of yours, and vice versa. So terms of trade already provide a very good hedge against risks. However, what we want to point out is that if on top of that, we don't know exactly what others are going to export, or there's residual uncertainty about the terms of trade, we inadvertently might be insuring each other. It's like, I don't know that I'm helping you by exporting a lot, and then afterwards, like, oh, actually, I don't have a lot of goods, I help you more. So there's increased opportunities for trade and risk sharing if both parties are uninformed. So in this sense, going back to your question, information frictions can change trade dynamics, especially because more information is going to make exports vary more, and that's going to reduce terms of trade volatility. If we're in an environment that is more uncertain, we cannot really condition our exports on each other's. That's going to increase terms of trade volatility. And we go back to my earlier point that might increase average returns to trade and therefore increase more uncertain environment increases trade.
You suggest that uncertainty increases both the mean and variance in return to exporting. How do different types of risk preferences among exporters influence trade flows in an uncertain environment?
Exactly. So what I've been talking about is that you have these two forces, right? Like an average return to exporting and volatility, variance, uncertainty effect. Now, again, if you're a risk-averse, let's say, entrepreneur, and you dislike this risk, how important is your aversion to this risk is going to be one of the key forces that is going to perhaps pull back on your trade. But that's not enough. And here is where the types of goods that we are trading and that we're producing and exporting matters a lot. So for instance, if you think about goods that are very substitutable, imagine that I could find the products locally or internationally. If there is more uncertainty about getting the goods from abroad, so they're highly substitutable, that might actually be a force that deters trade. But now let's think of an example. Imagine that I am need a very important superconductor component in order to make my chips, let's say, and I cannot source it locally. So if there is more uncertainty abroad, I might actually want to send more of my goods out so I make sure that I get these products for my production. So complementarity and substitutability in terms of, let's say, the bundle of goods that we use to produce or consume are key. So the message would be that when your preferences, and by preference it could be consumer preferences, or also we could say firms have preferences for different goods as well. So how are we combining domestic and foreign goods for production and for consumption? That complementarity between those goods is really shaping the effects of uncertainty. So if they're very substitutable, it's more likely that more uncertainty reduces trade, but the more complementary they are, more uncertainty is likely to generate more trade.
Professor, you mentioned that despite rising trade policy uncertainty since 2016, US exports relative to GDP have grown by 17%. What real-world factors might explain this counterintuitive trend?
So let me just clarify a bit. So actually, when we think about how trade policy uncertainty has increased, I would say, first, let me tell you how we usually like to measure this uncertainty. So pioneering work by Baker, Bloom, Davis, and others started to look at newspapers, articles, etc., in order to the fraction of articles that contain the words economic relative to all the articles written. It's a little bit, you think of like Google searches in a way, in relative terms. And this index allows us to track when policymakers, firms, etc., are talking a lot about this topic. So we would say that there's a lot of, or there's heightened economic policy uncertainty. Within this index, there's sub-indices, this trade uncertainty. And if you look at the trend, the time variation of this index, we see there's spikes in particular times. During the first Trump presidency, we had a big spike of this trade policy uncertainty during the US-China trade and currency wars. That was pretty high. But now this index is completely off the charts. Since I would say October of 2024, we think that we normalize that level to 100, the trade policy uncertainty index now is like a 2,500. So it's like an increase of 25 uncertainty. So we also see trade as a trend. So what it's difficult to compare two variables that have trends, but when we look at the effects of shocks, let's say comparing how an increase in trade uncertainty changes exports, the relationship is more nuanced. It's not perfectly, but we could see that on average, there tends to be a negative correlation. So other authors have also looked at this relationship between trade policy uncertainty and trade, and we tend to see negative effects. So I want to clarify that our work is not necessarily telling you that uncertainty is going to bring more trade. But I think the key point that we want to make is that there's not a natural or direct relationship that it's always more uncertainty, less trade, more nuanced. And I think there's many factors, not only policy uncertainty, but also we have supply chain disruptions, we have the rise of new technologies, we have the increase in multinationals. Many factors could be affecting this relationship.
Professor, your findings indicate that trade facilitates risk sharing, especially when both parties are uninformed. Can you elaborate on how uncertainty strengthens this risk sharing function?
Yes, so this relates to a previous question, and again, I think the key thing is that terms of trade, again, which are the relative prices of the goods that we are trading, paid by the amount of these goods out there in the market. So the terms of trade story, just to repeat a bit, I'll elaborate a bit, is that if you have, imagine you, Deepak, in India, have you're not producing a lot of, and I know that means that I might cut a little also on my exports because I understand my terms of trade are not going to be great. However, I know that I would still send, let's say, my products here from Spain, and I will be insuring you in these bad times. So that's why this terms of trade natural hedging mechanism gets amplified if we are not informed. Now, this is a good time to explain also why, when terms of trade are more volatile, we might actually get these higher returns. And the key thing is that terms of trade, because again, it's a ratio of prices and quantities, it can never go below zero. So it's bounded below. You can think of it as an option from derivatives markets where the downside risk is really bounded. However, it really can go very high, meaning that if you have a little, very tiny bit of your products that you're exporting and the other country had a lot, your goods are very valuable. So terms of trade are really unbounded above, always positive, but cannot go down below zero. So if you think of a distribution of, which I mean the different terms of trade that could actually happen in an economy when two countries are trading, if it becomes more dispersed, more volatile, that's also going to shift the mean upwards because you only get the good terms of trade, which again, those are the times in which it's insuring the country from these bad shocks, but it doesn't go below zero. So it's not symmetric. There's skewness that is really at the core of this risk trading mechanism that we are pushing forward.
How does the elasticity of substitution between domestic and foreign goods impact whether uncertainty increases or decreases trade?
Yes, so again, this both mean and volatility effects that we've been talking about, the elasticity of substitution between I would say, domestic and foreign varieties, which is known as the trade elasticity, which in many models is actually captured only by one number, okay? So this number tells you that if elasticity is high, it means that goods are very substitutable. Okay, like think of some generic cereal brands or some electronics that are very substitutable. So in that case, in a more uncertain environment, you might decide to cut down on this trade because it's very easy to substitute. There's not a if in a foreign product price becomes uncertain and you can actually switch to local products, that would be let's say exporters are becoming cautious in a way with high elasticity. However, going back to our previous discussion, if you have a low elasticity, which means goods are really, really complementary, you could think in production or even in consumption, okay? Then, again, imagine you have this conductor chip that you really need in order for your factory lines to keep running. Then even if the terms of trade are more uncertain, you still want to ensure you get that product. So you're going to be exporting more. So again, I think this is interesting because it combines the notion that we both need domestic and foreign goods. Similarly, our trade partner also needs our goods as well as their own goods, and how substitutable they are going to determine these effects of uncertainty. In the case of complementarity, it's like, you know what? I really need this other good. I'm still going to ship as a country. I need to get these other components. And that's all the situations when combined with the appropriate preferences in terms of resharing and other notions of attitudes towards risk, like prudence, temperance, might be affecting. So let me just say one thing, that in a lot of these models, we combine these preferences for risk with also this elasticity of substitution. So moving forward, it will be interesting to disentangle more these two forces, the preferences from the actually substitutability or complementarity. Okay.
In your analysis, you discussed the possibility of precautionary exporting. Could you explain how firm might increase export as a hedge against uncertainty?
Yes. So when one thinks about, let's say, precautionary, let me give you an example of precautionary savings, which is also a phenomenon that we see in households, families. Imagine that you might face some unemployment risk that may be increasing over time because maybe new technologies are entering. The data economy is coming, and some AI or machine learning technologies, there's a risk that may be affecting your occupation. If you live in a world in which you can perfectly insure against this risk, you buy insurance and that's it. But most of us, that we have access to a bank account that cannot really insure us against the potential that I lose my job and my occupation. So we might decide to do precautionary savings, which means that I'm going to start accumulating to have a buffer stock of liquid assets, some cash, etc. And in the case I do this ex ante, so that if exposed, I get one of these bad shocks, I have enough savings to do that. So let's make the analogy now with trade. So again, here, precautionary exporting, which is this concept we mentioned in our work, it would be like akin to building a stockpile of the goods. So you're stockpiling these foreign goods by shipping more of your own, such that in case that in the future those goods are not around, or trade policy changes, or there's a change in technology, demand, etc., you have those goods at your disposal. Okay. So when we say precautionary, we always need a benchmark. So here what we're saying is, like, without uncertainty, you would be exporting certain amounts. With uncertainty, you might be exporting more, even though it sounds contradictory, but here's like you're exporting more in order to ensure yourself against shocks that might make you not have these goods. And again, the elasticity substitution between domestic and foreign is key.
Professor Isaac, if uncertainty can sometimes promote trade, how should policymakers approach trade agreements and negotiations in an increasingly uncertain geopolitical environment?
Yes, I think so. First of all, the message for policymakers, academics, researchers, etc., is that we see uncertainty as having more nuanced effects. So it's not a direct relationship that more uncertainty is necessarily going to destroy trade because there is, and we still don't see. Now, that doesn't mean that policymakers should generate uncertainty in order to keep trade alive. As we mentioned before, there's many sources of uncertainty. Some of them come from demand shocks, preference shocks that suddenly consumers like a product and then another, technology shocks, supply chain disruptions, pandemics that we've seen. And perhaps those are the risks that firms would try to take actions in order to minimize them, but there's always some residual uncertainty. So in that sense, I would say that always for policymakers, the best is to have very clear notions of what's going to happen, commitment to those choices, and try to lower as much the uncertainty such that firms, consumers, exporters, importers, the rest of the economy makes decisions with the best information available and with the lowest uncertainty in something that can actually be controlled, which is policy. So again, it's not about creating uncertainty in order to promote trade. I would say that there's already enough sources of uncertainty that we shouldn't add on top of that more uncertainty like the ones we've seen today with the more erratic and different types of ways in which different countries at the moment are threatening and imposing tariffs with one another.
Professor, my last question. Your research suggests that standard parameterized trade models may be inconsistent with observed trade behavior under uncertainty. What modifications would you propose to improve these models for future analysis?
Very good question. So many models in trade, I want to say these are usually very complicated models where you have many countries trading with each other, firms choosing their different locations. So many times these models might be written in partial equilibrium. So really thinking about the individual responses of exporters to trade volatility. So here in one respect would be to push really to embed a lot of these channels in general equilibrium. So to also think about aggregate uncertainty, aggregate risks, and how that fits into individual choices. I would say there's also some margins that are important to consider. So most of the things we've been talking about today and in our work, we're talking about exporters that are already in a market. So they're only choosing how much to export, what is known as the intensive margin, but not really to enter or not. So that decision, which is known as the extensive margin, entering a market, entering a new regional product, the effects of uncertainty there, as we mentioned before, these real options effects tend to be very, very large. So my point would be that we should think of models that have both margins, an entry margin, and also thinking about this intensive margin. So general equilibrium, thinking about entry and exit. And I would say also taking more seriously and trying to quantify, measure, and model these information frictions. So there is a very nice historical example that was studied by Professor Steinwender. She has a paper where she explores how the introduction of the telegraph between the UK and the US in the 1800s really reduced uncertainty because now producers of cotton in the US were able to see the prices that were prevalent in Great Britain in order to make their decisions. So that's an example and where we can really see how the introduction of a new technology that reduces information frictions and uncertainty actually generated more trade. And I think moving to that direction of models that take seriously the effects of information, of policy uncertainty, of entry and exit, of these different margins that we've talked today could be the way to go. And especially also thinking of how can we measure this in the data. So part of the, if you allow me to talk briefly about, recap some of the topics that we talk in the book on the data economy, is actually to think how to put some value to information, value of data for firms, and this is not exception, no? Thinking how firms would be willing to pay to have more information about the foreign markets and about their terms of trade. So those are the topics or the areas where I think more or research and hopefully PhD students and other colleagues we're going to work on this area, try to value this information and then feeding these numbers into models that take into account all these margins to really see if we can predict the effects of, let's say, uncertainty on trade or new technologies on labor markets, etc.
Listeners, as we wrap up this insightful conversation, I want to extend my sincere gratitude to Professor Isaac Baley for joining us today. His deep expertise in economics, particularly in the realm of information frictions and macroeconomic implications, has provided us with invaluable perspectives. From exploring firms' pricing strategies to discussing how global uncertainty can shape international trade, Professor Baley has given us much to reflect on. His academic contributions and policy experience offer a unique lens into the complexities of economic decision-making in today's interconnected world. Thank you, Professor Belly, for sharing your time and knowledge with us today. It has been an honor to have you on Business Talk.
Thank you to Deepak for an excellent set of questions and looking forward for the next. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor.